Upon his release in December 1916 for his participation in the Easter Rising, Michael Collins spent the remaining years of his life fighting for Irish freedom. Understanding that his success would weigh heavily on information gathering, Collins was able to infiltrate the Dublin Metropolitan Police, which was the holy grail for British intelligence. The information gained by the IRA operatives working on the inside was invaluable and led to an operation that was called the Bloody Sunday Assassinations on the 21st of November 1920. Collins, armed with the details of his enemies, like names, addresses, ranks and responsibilities, put together a unit called the Squad, who killed over 30 people on that day, most of them being British Army officers. Although this act forced the British to respond in the most brutal and cowardly fashion, a clear message was sent to those who stood in the way of Irish freedom. In my opinion, this devastating blow exacted by the IRA was the turning point in the war. It sent fear through the British ranks as they came to the realization that their enemy was cunning and ruthless. Considering my military background, I can appreciate the need for good intel when preparing for an operation. It's not simply good enough to be in possession of an objective and a weapon. Much more needs to be considered. Each one of the British murdered by the Squad had a routine, which was recorded and exploited. Consideration was given towards the fact that the British targets were part of an armed unit, each being in possession of a service pistol and body armour. Each location to be visited for the killings needed to be assessed and familiarised by the relevant members of the Squad. Road networks, population size, terrain, obstacles and more needed to be considered and factored into the mission before execution. Even the time and the day of the assassinations were chosen deliberately. You can be guaranteed that it took months of information gathering and planning for what would end up being just a few minutes' work. Indeed, the killing was the easy part. One can only study this period of our history and admire the tactics and strategies employed by Ireland's greatest soldier. But make no mistake, Collins and his dedicated group of patriots would surely have failed to slay the great British invader if he didn't place such great value on information gathering. 100 years after his death in Bailnablaw, Ireland has a new enemy, and to my absolute disgust, this enemy has been democratically elected. Irish men and women, descended from those who gave all for this country, now suffocate the freedom they died for to satisfy a definition of tolerance that is utterly reprehensible and indeed a utopian dream. Dáil Éireann is made up of over 60 socialists, many of them self-professing, and I believe at least 130 politicians out of the 160 elected subscribe to the religion of wokeness with varying levels of intensity. I highlight this belief to illustrate how dire our situation happens to be. History should inform us that what is taking place in Ireland today will likely lead to a future of oppression, the seeds of which are already beginning to grow. The Irish utopia our political establishment seems to be aiming for is one that relies heavily on control and censorship. Much like the communist dictatorships, we will be given a common goal to relentlessly chase, with punishments and rewards at stake, depending on our levels of determination and progress. This will be done by creating a cashless society where the needs of all are met by the state, as long as we all behave. Our daily activities will be traced and measured to ensure our impact on the environment is minimal, and our medical requirements will always be up to date. A future where we must serve the common good without question, or suffer the wrath of the state. And if the ideas just expressed seem to be a little far out for you, I suggest you look at the history of the 20th century, modern China, and take interest in the Great Reset. In my opinion, we had our chance as a nation 2.5 years ago to halt this steady march towards madness, but the majority, being bled dry of all morality, accepted slavery as the new normal, and complied with tyranny. And again, I think it important to take a moment to point out that Ireland's army of ignorant anti-fascists were too stupid to identify the merging of the state and of private enterprise, a move designed to control the public through coercion during the so-called pandemic. You are indeed the drooling, smelly, blue-haired foot soldiers of actual fascism, and that is an objective fact. A friend of mine and fellow activist suggested that your group be renamed Fascism Against Ireland, which I found delightfully entertaining, considering its accuracy in the description of your behaviour. But moving on, I want to make the following confession. To those of you in power, your lives are absolutely meaningless to me. I think that those of you who voted yes to the Health Preservation Act 2020 and legalised the discrimination of the unvaccinated to forced submission should be at the very least imprisoned. Your very heartbeats offend me, but as a believer in freedom, I am willing to pursue my goals through peaceful discourse by speaking my honest beliefs and persuading those who are willing to listen. I have stood vehemently against many of the policies pursued and enacted in this country since March of 2020. I voiced my opinion against the lockdowns. I expressed my support for those who protest against the killing of unborn babies, whose right to do so is infinitely more important than a woman's desire to feel comfortable. I have made it clear that I cannot substitute gender theory for biology, and that I find the treatment of individuals with gender dysphoria utterly barbaric. I have said that I am willing to defend my property using violence if necessary. I have said that I would bring dissent to the doorstep of An Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, if he introduced vaccine mandates, lockdowns for the unvaccinated only, or the forced removal of persons to quarantine centres. The ideas I have put forth over the last year are rational and reasonable to many. However, in time, the expression of such ideas in support of human rights and civil liberty may very well be considered a crime, and any further legislation designed to curb dissent. At this stage, I have a question for each of the government ministers. If I am to be persecuted by Gardaí and hauled in front of a judge for giving voice to my deeply held beliefs, what would you have me do? Would you expect someone like me, an ex-soldier who has a passion for Ireland that is akin to rage, to quite simply submit to injustice? Would any of you in power, with your strong and harmful views, submit to such tyranny yourselves, or would you resist? I can tell you now that I haven't a notion of complying with any laws that seek to control thought and speech. In closing, I wish to say the following. I can't think of a more noble cause to pursue than the right to live free and in peace in the country of one's birth, free from force, free from coercion, free from state interference and indoctrination, indeed free from the dictates of the mob. And the removal of an individual's right to achieve these goals, free from persecution, will leave very little choice. Michael Collins and the brave volunteers of the IRA were left with much the same problem over 100 years ago, and with the choice of either submission to tyranny or violence, they chose violence. Will you cry foul if an Irish patriot follows in the footsteps of Collins's squad? Would you prefer a group of people to study your every move in the hopes of exacting punishment for violating the freedom hard won? Or would you prefer your enemies to challenge you through evidence and argument? All I can say is, I hope I am not undeservingly persecuted through any type of tyrannical legislation or state interference, as I much prefer the intellectual approach to dealing with my concerns.